Well, good evening and welcome to the Lowy Institute. My name is Susannah Patton and I'm the Director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Project Lead for the Asia Power Index here at the Institute. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we meet on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no more pressing concern for Australia than its alliance with the United States. So it's terrifically fortuitous timing for us that we have here with us some of the authors of a recent Carnegie Endowment report on the Australia-US alliance. Let me start by introducing our panellists this evening. To my right, Evan Feigenbaum is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment and a leading thinker on US Asia policy. Courtney Stewart is a Senior Managing Consultant at OCRT, a consulting firm in Canberra, with a prior defence-focused career spanning government, industry and think tanks. Matthew Sussex is an Adjunct Associate Professor at Griffith Asia Institute, and Sam Roggeveen is the Director of the International Security Program here at the Lowy Institute, and both Matt and Sam are contributors to Australia's strategic policy debate. So let me set the scene by saying that the Carnegie Endowment has published a really great report on the Australia-US alliance, which is very positive about the alliance, but it also highlights potential weaknesses, including whether Australia and the United States have aligned expectations about how they'll work together in a crisis or conflict, and also whether or not the structures of the alliance are right for the challenges that we face. And these were already thorny issues when the report was published late November last year, but they have only become more so since January, when Donald Trump's treatment of Europe, Canada, Ukraine, I think has caused many in Australia to question whether deeper enmeshment with the United States is either feasible or desirable. So let me ask Evan to frame up this discussion for us. So Evan, from your perspective, why did you want to write this report about the Australia-US alliance, and would it look different if you were publishing it today rather than last November?
Well, you've already invoked Donald Trump's name. I've been here 24 hours. I've heard his name about 450 times already. But I'm American, so this is my lived reality on a daily basis. So first, I want to thank Lowy. I want to thank Susannah, Sam, Michael. We really appreciate it. I'm a big admirer of this institution, and so we appreciate the chance to do this with you. We've invoked Trump, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about Donald Trump tonight. If I could just put him to the side for at least 2 minutes. The alliance has more than 8 weeks of history. He's been in office for 8 weeks. So as I was saying to Sam and Susannah upstairs, it's not a serious position to dismiss him, but we also need to recognize that there's a lot more going on in the alliance, and there's a lot of history. It's a 70-year alliance if you date it to Menzies and Anzus. It's an 80-year alliance if you date it to Curtin and Turn to America, Looking to America. And in that time, there's been a presumption, I think, by Americans and Australians that first in the 1940s, the cause of war fighting, but then subsequently defense, deterrence, and now potentially defense and war fighting again are best served in the context of an alliance. So in that context, why did we do the project? When we started this, before Donald Trump came back to office about a year ago, I mean, I think our thought, as Susannah was implying, is that the alliance is important, but we thought there was a lot of rah-rah about it at a very high level. There's a lot of talk about how we fought shoulder to shoulder since 1918, but there's a lot less focus on how to divvy up roles and missions in the context of potentially high-intensity conflict in the Indo-Pacific, which is what we're talking about. And so we wanted to dig into that beyond just the elite circle of people who do that in Washington and Canberra or in Hawaii. And that's what we did. So we assembled this stellar team to put together this volume that I hope you'll look at, where we looked a lot at regional strategies, force, posture, defense, science, technology, and innovation, coalition building, alliance roles and missions, and so on. There's a lot going on in the report. It's very prescriptive, but what I would say, just to highlight a couple of top lines, a lot of our focus was really on communicating some messages to Washington in particular. One is that, if I may be blunt about it, screaming China in a crowded theater will not be sufficient to foster the kind of coordination and coalition building and operational coordination in the alliance that's going to be needed. This is something that I encounter with American alliances well beyond just Australia. There's a presumption that the Americans tend to have, and I say this as an American, that because our defense strategies are aligned, they are therefore identical. And as we'll probably talk about, they're not between the US and Australia. And even when we share the diagnosis of the strategic environment, we don't necessarily share the same prescriptions. Second, the debate in the United States has really been swamped disproportionately by the idea of integrating Australian forces and US forces in Australia into US war planning. But as Matt and Peter Tesh point out in a chapter in this volume, no Australian government, Labor or coalition, is going to outsource sovereign choices or pre-commit across the board to deploy Australian forces in this or that contingency because the United States says so. And the US isn't quite focused on that, nor is the United States sufficiently focused on the pluralism in the Australian strategic debate. So a lot of what we wanted to do was focus the American mind on hard operational choices here. And then there's a lot of prescriptive messages for Australia too. And I know you're going to have a debate about Trump and there's going to be a debate about the alliance here. But I think frankly, and it goes to your last question about whether we do it differently, if you are as ruthless and self-interested about Australia's strategic interest as Donald J. Trump is going to be about his view of American strategic interests, I think your eye will more or less come back to the alliance in ways that are consistent with what we tried to get at in this volume. For one thing, Australia's strategic interests go beyond just the defense of mainland Australia, your maritime power. There's issues in the sea lanes. For another, holding adversarial forces at risk when they have range advantages, that brings you back to the alliance. And there are other issues too. So long story short, we wanted to dig in a little bit in these operational areas to try to focus the mind on both sides of the Pacific, but particularly on the US side in ways that we thought were not happening sufficiently. That's the context.
Yeah, thank you. That's great, and it would be great to hear a bit more from you later about how you think some of the ideas have landed. Courtney, let me open it up to you. You contributed a chapter in this report, so I'm interested to hear from you. How do you see the opportunities to strengthen the US-Australia alliance over the next few years, and also how do you look at those kind of challenges and the questions that are being raised now about the alliance?
Thank you. Personally, I think there's a significant potential to increase defense cooperation within the alliance, even under this Trump administration. But I feel like that will depend on Australia. It's Australia's choice on how much it wants to lean in and how it navigates US expectations about allies. There's a few things that I would keep in mind as an Australian, being a dual, living in DC and living in Canberra, and kind of seeing both sides. A few points to keep in mind is, from afar, I don't see this Trump administration having a clear foreign policy. I think Donald Trump's foreign policy is very much led by his personal relationships with heads of state. And so if he does not have a positive relationship with a prime minister or another president, then that will translate to those nations not having a positive relationship. So I think it will be incumbent upon the Prime Minister of Australia, come after the election to have that positive relationship with the president. That's one key point. I think another one is the importance of the Indo-Pacific to the United States. The Indo-Pacific is not Europe, and I don't think that we should look at our situation in the same way as what the Europeans are going through. The SecDef has come out and reaffirmed the importance of this region, and I think if you give it a few more weeks, I think with the NATO situation and the Ukraine crisis, I think the focus will turn to the Indo-Pacific, which is its long-term interest. Another thing to keep in mind is that, for defense cooperation, Australia does not have a sense of urgency in the way that, I think if I put my American hat on, that I see, and that's cause for concern. Another undercurrent here is the sense that Australia can go it alone. That's just not possible. It does not have the scale, the mass, It has to work with others. I'm sure Sam has a strong opinion about that as well. But to answer your question, I think the potential is significant, but it really hinges on Australia's choices that it makes. And it's actually a lot more in the driver's seat, I think, than it takes credit for moving forward. One of the areas that it can lean in defense cooperation is in more institutionalized defense cooperation, and I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for that. I'll turn it over to Sam, seeing as your name has been invoked, which is, I mean, what's your take on how Australia should be approaching its alliance with the US, and maybe also your reflection on Courtney's observation that there is a lack of urgency in the way that Australia is approaching the current moment?
Well, maybe I'll start by just taking up Evan's invitation to look beyond the Trump administration, because I think that's very wise. I think it's exactly right not to overlook the first 7 odd weeks. It is fairly seismic, what we've experienced. But on the other hand, 7 weeks is not enough time, not enough evidence to make definitive judgments about the administration, let alone the United States more broadly. One of Australia's great international relations scholars, Owen Harries, used to talk about the parochialism of the present. It's a beautiful phrase that sometimes the less beautiful phrase recency bias is also used. And that's a tendency that we all have when we're making judgments about issues, to basically grasp at whatever's nearest to hand or nearest to mind. So if we're thinking about, well, how reliable is the United States? Well, on the evidence of the last 7 weeks, you'd say diabolically unreliable. But on the evidence of 70 years, of course, you'd have to make a very different judgment. So I think Evan's mindset there is exactly the right one. So let's then take a slightly broader view and look at the last 30 odd years since the end of the Cold War. And in regards to Australia's primary security interests, I don't think that offers much more reassurance than the Trump administration is offering, quite frankly. We've seen in that period, since the end of the Cold War, the most rapid, most dramatic expansion of any military force since the Second World War in China, in the People's Liberation Army. And yet, in that span of time, despite the fact that particularly in recent decades, the United States has committed itself to competing with China at the presidential level, despite that fact, we've seen almost no change in American force structure and force posture in the Asia-Pacific region. We've also seen signature American economic initiatives in Asia not pursued, abandoned, in fact. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is what I have in mind. We've also seen, I think, an important omission, which is that despite formal American policy commitments and American policy documents talking about China as a peer competitor, we haven't yet seen an American president talk to the American people about competition with China. And keep in mind that if this competition is really on, if the United States is preparing to fight a Cold War against China, then this is the biggest thing that it has ever taken on, much bigger than the Soviet threat ever was. As the American scholar Rush Doshi has pointed out, the United States has never faced an adversary or a group of adversaries with more than 60% of America's GDP, except China passed that mark in around 2014. So it's by far already the biggest project that America has taken on. And yet no US president has yet faced the American public and said, listen, this is now our defining purpose. Our national purpose is to compete with China. So I think in the absence of those signals, allies like Australia have to think that, okay, maybe their heart's not in this. Maybe their heart's not in this and we have to do more for ourselves. That's not by any means a call to abandon the US alliance. It has many benefits for Australia, but it is, I think, a caution to treat the alliance as a much more transactional thing than we had previously imagined. And I'll close by just observing that we've never taken a transactional view, particularly I'd say since 9/11, we've taken a much more sentimental view about the US alliance. And we've heard successive prime ministers invoke 100 years of mateship, for instance, that was a phrase during the Morrison government. And successive prime ministers have talked about shared sacrifice, Australia and America going to war together for over 100 years. It is striking that when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faced his country in a national address right after Trump announced tariffs against the United States, it is striking that Prime Minister Trudeau used exactly the same language. So how stunning, I thought personally, to see the same language invoked in those circumstances as we have invoked it in the past in circumstances where we thought the United States was in our corner. I just thought that was a record scratch moment to hear the Canadians talk in that way when the Trump administration had declared a kind of economic war against Canada. I'll close there.
Yeah, thanks. So Matt, Evan mentioned an important idea, which is that Australia and the US have interests which align, but which are not identical. Can you talk a bit more about that idea and whether or not you think in the current moment those interests are going to diverge further?
Yes, certainly, Samantha, and thanks also to Susannah, and thanks to Sam for hosting. It's always nice to be back at Lowy. Look, I think that when we look at issues like convergence and divergence, we tend to think about it very much in the moment, as though Donald Trump is looming over our shoulders with an additional 25% tariffs based on what we decide. And as Evan, I think, points out quite rightly, the alliance is a lot longer than that, and it has much more of a history. That's not to go down the values path and to say, rah, rah, the alliance is just simply wonderful. I remember being in the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C. a few years ago where they were debuting mateship lager. It was exceptionally cringy because, of course, Australians
Joe Hockey's.
Yeah, Australians don't drink lager, so, well, not anymore. But it's not good, not to go down the values path, but I think it is speaking a lot more to notions of purpose and expectations when it comes to alliances, that there's been fairly decent convergence at the top level as to what the alliance is for and more or less what the different parts within it might do. The only time I can think of where there was a really serious conversation about this was during the global war on terror, where there was, I think, a divergence between what the alliance was seen as being for. Under the Bush Junior administration, it was seen as something that should be used to basically fight against threats to American interests that may or may not be within the region. Whereas from the Australian perspective, the alliance was for basically strategic stability within the region, and that came with it the notion of the potential constrainment, to use Gerald Segal's nice term, of China. I don't think since then we've had such a critical evaluation of what the alliance is for as we are now. And the notion of purpose and the notion of expectation is something I think that is really throwing up a lot of confusion in Australian policy circles. Part of that, obviously, is due to the odd behaviour of Donald Trump, but to an extent that's just noise. I think the thing that really does prompt potential divergence around expectations is the lack of a really clearly articulated view from the United States as to what its Indo-Pacific strategy is going to be. Because if you're sitting in Russell, or if you're sitting in DFAT, the questions you're asking are very much about, well, under what types of scenarios and what types of contingencies is Australia going to have to commit some kind of either military personnel or swing in with diplomatic support, build bridges, do other things perhaps in the sort of sub-threshold space when it comes to crises. And we've had basic silence from DC on Washington DC on that. So I think at the sort of strategic level, it's very important that Australia receives some kind of indication as to what the US Indo-Pacific approach is. If it's going to contribute towards strategic stability, what does it see as Australia's role in that? If it's not going to contribute to strategic stability, if it's going to muscularly challenge China, then that also prompts the question of, well, is it the fact that the United States is more or less indifferent to what happens to its allies, because the far more important thing is the great power competition element to it. So that's at the very top strategic level. There are also questions, I think, at the operational level when it comes to what the ADF is used for and under what contingencies. There is an extent to which the American war planning approach for the Indo-Pacific is about the high seas, right? High tempo, high seas battle. Whereas the Australian context, particularly since the DSR has, and the National Defence Strategy has been all about littoral defence, that this is, the Australian Armed Forces do things in the green water, not necessarily on the high seas. And AUKUS sort of rests uncomfortably between those, because on the one hand, AUKUS Pillar 1 is about power projection so that you can hit the Chinese mainland in the blue water, but on the other hand, it's also very, very important when it comes to protecting sea lanes of communication. And this goes back to Evan's point that, you know, eventually, if you take a look at the strategic risks and threats facing you, you come back to the alliance, because there's no one else that can provide you with that kind of reach and range than the United States. So going it alone under those circumstances really isn't an option. So I think, just to sum up, I think the way that Australia solves its convergence-divergence conundrum is to do things like find areas where, in fact, it can be both independent, sovereign, ally of the United States, but also a relatively constructive one. That might be in diplomacy, it might be about helping to unite different nodes of US security partnerships. We often talk about the hub and spoke system that the US set up. Well, you know, deepening cooperation with the low-hanging fruit, with Japan, with Korea, but also with others within the region that are like-minded. Those are things that Australia can do, and also potentially realistically act as a kind of translation mechanism for American interests and Southeast Asian, Northeast Asian interests too, to kind of mediate potential disputes. So I think some of those things are things we would try and move towards to resolve those types of tensions and challenges in the alliance.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you also touched on a point about major power competition and the US approach there. So I'm keen to come back to Evan on that. But I thought I might just throw it back to Courtney, because Courtney, you mentioned in what you said earlier that you could talk a bit more about defence industrial integration. Just be interested to get your views on whether there are ways, to Matt's point, that Australia and the US could be coordinating or integrating more deeply that could help actually address some of these questions around what our different roles could and should be.
Well, thank you. I think I disagree a little bit with Matt on that the US-China great power competition is the be-all, end-all. I actually think that, yes, there is that competition, but that Australia is competing as well. All the countries in the region are competing. And I think that we're so used to hearing it only in great power competition, but what is competition? It's a fight for influence, right? It's a fight for, and I say fight in the loosest possible way. It's the pursuit of your own interests and trying to seek to influence the international community to those ends. So in that regard, I think Australia needs to look at competition not as an outside player, that they're just, you know, affected by it as it happens around them. We are in our own competition, and we need to be looking at it a little bit differently. Also, I don't think, you know, in comparison to what Matt's saying, I don't think Australia, and it's very common for us here to say, let's just wait for America to tell Australia what it wants from us. Tell us what your expectations are. I think that Australia needs to decide for itself more what its expectations are. And, you know, having worked the US alliance system in East Asia, I don't think that US allies appreciate how much influence they have over stating what their preferences are and what their desires are. It's not, you know, a one-way street, it is a two-way street. And I think Australia needs to appreciate how much influence it does have and think of those things more directly. And that's where I get to the point about the article that I drafted for Carnegie. And I'm really just seeking Australia to really think bigger, think more ambitiously about its future and what it wants, and the role that it can take, a more leadership position in the region, and I'm talking about Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, and how it can do more. It's doing so much now that it doesn't get enough credit for, and the potential for Australia, unlike so many other countries in the Indo-Pacific, can step up in a way that no one else can. Also, it does have the operational history with the United States that can't be matched by another partner. So in that regard, what I'm proposing is a new institutional structure. I'm calling it a joint deterrence force. And let me back up as well to pitch why that's important. To me, the institutional structure, the security architecture in our region, it's not suited for, I hate to use this, but I'm going to use it, to plug and play of other nations. There's the hub and spoke model that exists, and what that is, America is at the center and its allies are the spokes. But what happens is that you get challenges where Australia wants to work with South Korea. Australia wants to work with Japan. And so often you have to pass through America to do that, and that's very challenging. That's not always in our interest. We do need to diversify more. So what is that structure? Right now, there's a lattice work is what it's described as. It's many, very effective minilaterals and multilaterals and security arrangements and cooperations and initiatives, and those are all very, very good. But no one is working together to pull all of these things together towards a meaningful purpose. It's not efficient, and in that regard, it's not effective, and it's particularly not effective for deterrence. So basically to, unfragment that and pull it together, the idea would be to have a combined, and combined is multinational, and joint is multi-service, and a force is bringing them all together. And so you would operationalize that in a new institutional structure. Two of these very prominent bodies already exist. One is in Northern Europe. It's called the Joint Expeditionary Force. It's for Northern Europe. Another one called the CMF. It exists. It's the Combined Maritime Forces. It's in the Middle East. It's got over, I think, 47 nations now, 10 of which are from the Indo-Pacific, including Australia. And these are bodies that exist, standing bodies. It's not one country leading them. It's a diversified multinational effort. They can be operationalized, but what it does for deterrence and for these individual countries is, based on interest, you can create combined task forces. And you don't have to join as a nation all of the task forces. You can join those that are important to you, and that puts the power back on the other countries. So that's pretty much the proposal. I could go on to it for a long time, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, Evan, it'd be great to hear from you about, I guess, the lattice work framework was something that the Biden administration pursued quite a lot, the idea of networking between alliances in Asia. How relevant do you think that's going to be under the Trump administration? And it would also be great to hear from you as well about this kind of question around major power competition and how you think the US is going to approach that.
Yeah, I mean, they're linked, partly because this region is very diverse, and it's increasingly multipolar, and it's filled with large, capable, economically powerful, and highly self-interested powers. And because the United States doesn't get to just order all those countries around, the region is evolving in ways that sometimes belie American preferences. Now they're linked because, particularly given some of the strategic challenges the United States has in the region, but is, in my view, not responding to, including not adapting to the situation I just described, there's going to be a premium for other countries to forge coalitions with one another. And, Sam mentioned the economic area to get us away from the security, but that's a good example. I mean, if you think, you mentioned the TPP, the CPTPP. President Obama, back in 2016, famously gave an interview to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, and he was asked to make the case for the TPP. And after, muttering about American export opportunities, he said something like this. He said, if we don't write the rules out in that region, China's going to write the rules out in that region. But there was a market test of what he said, because if President Obama had been right about that, then when President Trump took the US out of the TPP, what should have happened? The US withdrew as the rule writer. China should have come in to write the rules. But as you know, in Australia, because you were a motive force behind what happened next, that's not actually what happened. What happened is the other 11 got together and forged an agreement with neither the United States nor China as party to the agreement. So that gets at what I'm saying about the diversity of the region. I think there's going to be a premium on that, particularly if the United States doesn't get it together strategically. The question is, what kind of region do we all want to live in? And who's going to shape it? And if the Americans take a temporary pause from this, there's going to be a premium on Australia and other democratic countries trying to shape an open order. Now, on the Americans, which gets us to the alliance a little bit. I mean, I'm famous for a member of the American strategic class. I'm famously cranky about the U.S. in this region. There's a lot of high-level nonsense in Washington, where I hail from. Alliance is good, yay Quad, boo Xi Jinping, and so on. But the reality is that the U.S. has increasingly made China the alpha and omega of its entire approach to the region. And in my view, that's problematic because it doesn't really reflect the region I just described to you. So I worked at the State Department during the Bush administration. I had a boss named Richard Armitage, who you may know here in Australia.
Oh, yes.
And Rich famously, well, he's famous here for a lot of reasons, some of which relate to things he said about the alliance. But Rich famously said something like, if you want to get China right, you need to get Asia right. And what he meant by that was you need to shape the strategic environment around China's choices. But in the last 5 to 7 years, the Americans have kind of turned Rich's aphorism upside down. Instead of getting China right by getting Asia right, they're making every policy relationship and initiative in the region derivative of the, you can call it strategic competition, strategic focus with China. And the problem is, number one, as I was saying, it's not really adapted to the realities of the region. But the second, for you in Australia, if I were Australian, or Japanese, or Korean, or Thai, or whatever, the message that sends is if you only care about us in the context of your own strategic competition with China, you basically reduced us into being a proxy in your great power competition. And so that's not a helpful message from the Americans, and it doesn't really reflect American interests. But that's not your problem. That's our problem in Washington, and we're not getting a lot of traction on that. So then where are we? Where we are is that I think there's a premium for countries like Australia and other allies of the United States to step in with or without the Americans to shape the kind of region that we all should want to live in. And that's some of what we address this in the report in the sections on security partnerships, things that Australia could do with Indonesia, with Japan, the spokes working with the spokes, and so on. And there's a lot that can be done there. What I would say, I was struck by what both Sam and Matt said, where you said there was insufficient clarity in the American approach to the region. That's interesting because I had the impression that virtually every government in the Indo-Pacific preferred that the U.S. did not move in the direction of that kind of clarity, because I can tell you what the direction of travel is. Yeah. The direction of travel is toward a highly adversarial and highly securitized relationship with China. And my impression is no Australian government, and frankly, no government anywhere else in the Indo-Pacific really wants that. So be careful what you wish for, because actually you can work in this context a little bit more easily. In fact, that's exactly what we mean by expectation gaps in this report. What the Americans are interested in, as I said at the outset, is thinking hard about how Australia fits into US war planning. And by the way, a lot of that is in one contingency, which is beyond your immediate neighborhood. It's up in the Taiwan Strait. And whether it's the Defense Strategic Review or the national security strategies here, or you pick your government, Albanese government, Morrison government, you can go back. There's a much more localized approach to the geographic locus of conflict for the defense of Australian interests. And so be careful what you wish for, but also I think the direction of travel in American policy is not toward strategic competition, it's toward what I would call adversarial antagonism with China. Focused heavily on one contingency and in a very securitized context, where economic flows, everything is security. And if that's not where Australia is positioned, and I can even though I'm not Australian, I can pretty definitively say that doesn't seem to be where Australia is positioned. That's part of what the conversation in the alliance needs to be, because that's precisely what we meant by expectation gaps. And in the defense area, that's the conversation we need to have about force posture, for instance. We've had a lot of initiatives, Marines in Darwin, Submarine Rotational Force West. This force posture stuff is important, and actually will have a more near-term effect on deterrence potentially than AUKUS or these things with much longer timelines. But, and then I'll shut up, but the problem is that a lot of it is generated from the bottom up. It's operators doing force posture stuff, but there's not a lot of rethink about the alliance that's happening. And Stefan Proling actually points that out in his chapter on force posture. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think what it means is the Americans are not everything to you.
Adversarial antagonism, did I get that right?
Yep.
That's what you said.
Yep.
Yeah.
But, well, actually, I had a question for you on that, which is that you may very well be, I'm pretty sure you are, describing the views of the consensus within the blob, as Obama used to call it, in Washington very well. But do you think your president regards Taiwan as an existential interest for the United States?
Our current president,
Yeah.
President Trump? You know, I mean, President Trump, he's like, I come from New York City, where we have something called alternate side of the street parking. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can park on the left side of the street, and on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you can park on the right. It's a congestion measure. He's a little like alternate side of the street parking. You never quite know, you know, which you're going to get transactional Trump or strategically hawkish Trump. So, you know, without over-determining it, I think, you know, if you believe people close to him, I mean, he's not particularly invested in Taiwan. John Bolton has this story in a memoir that he wrote about being national security advisor, where I think if I remember the story correctly, he's briefing the president on Taiwan, and the president takes a pen out of his pocket and throws it on the desk and says something like, you see the pen, that's Taiwan, you see the desk, that's China. That story, you know, captures a little bit. Having said that, you know, the U.S. has broader interests in stability and peace and security in the Taiwan Strait, and President Trump is surrounded by a lot of, let's call them very hawkish people, but also people who take an interest in coercion of Taiwan. And so I think it's going to be very contingency specific is my very direct answer to your very direct question. And I wouldn't spend a lot of time psychoanalyzing the president or thinking through where he is on any given day of the week, because I think it'll be very contingency dependent. And I think the Chinese think about it that way too. And that's part of it, you know, they're not quite sure what they're going to get with him. Does that make sense? Okay.
So we're going to open it up to audience Q&A in just a minute. So please think about your questions. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask you, Matt, just to elaborate on the point that Evan was making about force posture and that potentially being something that's very significant for the alliance, but actually doesn't get a lot of attention here compared with AUKUS, which has been the big shiny thing that has kind of clouded out the sun. So could you talk to us a bit about what that means for the alliance?
Yeah, I mean, it's we tend to conceive of ourselves, so this goes back to broader debates in Australian strategic policy circles, I think, rather than just simply where we station troops. This notion of are we a global power with regional interests, or are we a regional power with global interests? Now, you could say that's splitting hairs, but it's something that, you know, animated Australian security conversations very much since the end of the Cold War. Howard, of course, saw us as much more of a global player, whereas Labor governments tend to pitch Australian security and defence interests closer to home. Now, it's certainly the case, I think, that when we look at force design within an Australian context, we have preferenced, and correctly so, the maritime dimension as the one in which we are most likely to face, you know, contingencies that we will need to respond to. That, however, does lead to some tensions within the ADF, I think, about the extent to which different arms and different services are being prioritised. And of course, you can't escape AUKUS under this context because $368 billion is an enormous amount of money that doesn't necessarily leave an awful lot else. So, I mean, I think that the way the current thinking is going is an integrated force is something that we very much want to achieve, and that we want to posture that more or less in line with the National Defence Strategy in terms of the northern approaches, but they must be able to do other potential contingencies as well. So a lot of it is focused on littoral defence. A lot of it is focused even on things like doing counterinsurgency potentially within Australia's own region, and even peacekeeping missions too. So there's a lot of missions that the ADF conceivably needs to be able to do, but only so much capacity that it has. I think I read the other day that Australia currently has 53 peacekeepers on missions globally, which is a really far cry from where we used to be. We used to be a sort of peacekeeping provider. Now pivoting more towards a country that can try to exercise that deterrence by denial function that we keep talking about a lot, but in order to do that, we do need reach and we do need range. And I think this is where the Americans come into the question, that in order to have access to the type of systems we need, whether it's Tomahawk missiles, whether it's new air-launched missiles that will be able to have far greater range, they're really the only provider, right? So in terms of war stocks, I think that the United States is going to be absolutely central to that picture. So the extent to which the alliance may deepen or may drift a little bit, I think the capacity to be heavily invested within the American defence sector is going to be very, very important. But so too is that degree of interoperability that previously we've talked about. I probably wouldn't go so far as to talk about integrated forces. I think that's something we were talking upstairs about. Paul Dibb once saying to Evan that this was absolutely horrendous. There would be absolutely no way that there would be an integrated force with Australians participating. Now, 6 months ago, you'd say that was possible. Give the relationship another 12 to 18 months, and it might be that Paul Dibb comes and says exactly the same thing. Absolutely no way. But the capacity to integrate is there. The capacity also to posture forces with other countries like Japan, like Korea, I think is something that needs to develop as well. And that's something that is developing. We do exercise all the time. It is fundamentally, though, reliant not just on will, but also on the capacity to perform the types of missions that we're going to need to perform. And when we're talking about Japan and Korea, they're further away. So it means that conversations also have to happen with the Indonesians, with the Singaporeans, and with others as well.
All right, let's open it up to questions. Please keep your questions short and sharp and identify yourself and any relevant affiliation. I can see Jane down the front and another one over there.
Thank you so much, and welcome to Sydney in Australia. I'm a recently retired career diplomat, have spent many a time in Washington. Well, I was in Washington and Honolulu, and the Carnegie Nuke Fest is a place that I spent a lot of time. Courtney and Evan, you've made some fantastic points about Australia and what we need, what we want. Do we know what we want? And I feel that we don't. I feel that I've seen a real sort of flummoxing around. We don't, we're trying to have it all. We're trying to deal with the new world, really. And we'll take time to work it out. And I agree with Sam and others about we do have a strong foundation on which to work out our future, but we're not quite there yet, in my view. However, I'm really interested in comments about the others. Our future lies, I think, in forging and strengthening those relationships we've already developed in our own region, to an extent in Europe, but I'm looking more at Southeast Asia. I'm looking at the other US formal allies, Philippines and Thailand. I've often scratched my head about how we deal with our fellow allies. Korea and Japan, perhaps more obvious. And as you rightly say, though, when you live in Honolulu and you go to these exercises, you see the allies working together, and it's very reassuring. However, I'm trying to work out, and I'd love your comments, any of you, on the future of our relationships with the others in our region. Japan is the most obvious, but some of the others that I've mentioned as well.
Okay, thanks. We might take one more question at the same time. Just the gentleman down there. Alyssa, just behind, just here. Thank you.
Hi, Jersey from Pacific Polarity. This question might be more directed towards Sam, although other panelists could respond as well. So in the past, you'd previously talked about America. You previously mentioned that you wanted to see America make some strategic sacrifice to demonstrate its commitment to the Indo-Pacific before you might consider it as credible. So do you think this abandonment to some extent of Europe could be that, or could become that, or might it produce the opposite effect? Thanks.
Okay, those are great questions. Would either of you like to comment on the question around how we work with others in the context of the US alliance, or this question around what lessons Australia is taking away from US security policy towards Europe?
Well, how about I can quickly tackle them both. So hi Jersey, nice to meet you after a bit of correspondence. So my argument for a long time is that until the United States makes commitments to Asia that are truly costly, then we have, both politically and economically, then we have reason to doubt US commitment to this region. Now, the policy that the Trump administration has adopted in Europe may very well be the first stage of a kind of the Obama era rebalance finally coming to pass. All I would say is that for the moment, there's very little evidence of that. The main evidence for that proposition is probably in the words of people like Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio, who are so-called prioritisers. These are people who say, well, we're overcommitted in Europe and the Middle East, we need to move to Asia. Fine, they may have their day. I don't think the president himself is a prioritiser in that degree. I don't think he has any interest in strategic competition with China. Economic competition, certainly, but not strategic. The other point I'd make is even if the US were thinking of doing that, and you imagine tens of thousands of troops suddenly being freed from duties in Europe, who would host them? That's not clear to me at all. And then after, let's say that problem's overcome, what's to stop the Chinese from then responding? The Chinese have a far higher ceiling for this. Or another way of putting it is if there's going to be an arms race between China and the United States, I think China's far better positioned to win it than the United States is. So I don't think, even if against all odds that kind of rebalancing takes place, I don't think we should draw much reassurance from it. On the first question, I would just say that I'm sorry to see countries such as Indonesia in particular be put in the other category. It's much more important than that. In fact, it's absolutely central and vital, as I'm sure you agree. That wasn't the intent of the question. But look, for all of the near panic that we've seen in Australia over the last few years about China and its military capabilities, that would be as nothing if against a threat of an Indonesia that was both very wealthy and hostile to Australia. That is a future that we very much should want to avoid here. Indonesia is going to be wealthy, so we need to ensure that it is never hostile to Australia, because that would be a far worse future than the one we face now vis-a-vis China, because China's far away and Indonesia's not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked the question about partnerships. Southeast Asia in particular is salient for Australia. It's also salient for the United States, but it's enormously diverse. And some of the polities that were coherent and strong 30 years ago are not necessarily as coherent today. And so the good news, at least for the United States, is we have a more diverse approach to the region than we did 30, 40 years ago. You framed it in terms of treaty allies. Thailand's a tough racket. Close to China, doesn't have a stable government, lots of domestic issues in Thailand. So they're our oldest treaty ally in the region, but they're a treaty ally in a very different sense than the others are. The Philippines, it's like a whole new country every 6 years. And even if you look at the relationship with China, from Gloria to Noi Noi to Duterte to now, So what prevails now strategically is not necessarily what's going to prevail in a few years. But I think it's important to think of like long-term investments, which is, to Sam's point, what's important to do with Indonesia. It's also important to do with Vietnam and the others. And Australia brings things to the table that the United States, which is less focused, frankly, doesn't. On the other question, it's interesting, this question of how committed the U.S. is and how it shows commitment. It's interesting, because if you mirror image it, the Chinese think we're pretty committed in this region. They're upset about AUKUS. They're upset about all these American bases. They're upset about all these Biden security initiatives around alliances. So their takeaway from the last several years is that the United States is, in its way, looking more and more committed. I think if I were going to advance a critique, mine would be not that we're not committed, it's that we're secure, we're long on security and short on everything else. And my view is that's not changing either. We're also long on attitude and short on delivery. But the reality is we're a player in this region, and the Chinese know it, and they behave accordingly. So I'm not as concerned about that as I am about the operational requisites of the kinds of things that we tried to get in at the report.
Let's take a couple more questions if there are. Yep, I can see two down the back. We'll take them both, thanks.
John Connor, the assumption seems to be in large respect that the US is the same as it's always been. You know, to my mind, Trump is not just an aberration. He is in many respects. But the reason why he's president, or the reasons why he's president, and why many people who might have voted against him, nevertheless, have very different ideas from their predecessors. One is the assumption, I think, Sam, you said the president should have, for instance, a conversation on China. But the assumption that the American population at large is, at this point, particularly concerned about international status and so-called interests, and I'll come to them in a second, is I'm not sure true at all. A lot of the American population is totally war-weary. The people who've actually fought the wars, who've suffered the casualties in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere, have had it, up to the eyeballs and beyond. And so, in some ways, it's almost back, in my observation, getting back in many respects, and also you've got big ethnic differences now in the United States. That reflects itself in a different cultural set of interests. And the fact is that the old Anglo come European nexus is 50% at best. In some ways, it seems to me the US is almost at a point that's not too far from the point it was at in the last century between the two world wars. Economically, it's big and powerful enough and big enough market to be an autarky. Not as prosperous as it could be in numerous other events, but it could survive, do well, and have one of the highest standard of livings in the world. So then when you get to the question of interests, to my observation, are predominantly economic. Other interests, military and other interests, flow from economic interests, by and large, historically. And there are, I know, exceptions to that. And I'm not at all sure that at this point much analysis has actually been done as to what American interests, in that sense, in the Pacific, may be. I don't think they are as profound or as valued as they were. For instance, I doubt if much of the US population is really concerned about the level of US direct investment in the rest of the world.
Could you bring it to your question, please?
So, anyway, I'll finish on that.
Thanks.
Crawford from CBUS Super. I think my question is related. You mentioned, Courtney, that after Ukraine, Europe, Indo-Pacific is next. Who are they going to come to first? Who do the United States want to speak to first? How far down the pecking order is Australia? And that might give us an indication as to where we are in the importance of the United States. And I'm sure Evan will give his opinion as well, but I'd be interested in his view.
Thanks. It'd be great to hear from you, Courtney, on both of those US interests and where Australia sits in the regional alliances.
Listen, I think with regard to the gentleman's first question and remarks, any population is not always going to align with whatever the politics of the day are. And the US is an enormous country with a huge and diverse range of opinions. if there was an election tomorrow, I couldn't even tell you how it would go confidently. So would he be reelected if they called an election today? I have no idea. But there's so much uncertainty. But I think what we're seeing now is that Americans in general feel like the role that they've played on the world stage and the commitments they've made have been at their own expense. And life in the United States isn't as great as it could be, and they need to roll that back. I think that's a general opinion, and I think I don't take any particular issue with that statement, just the way that it's probably being done right now. Cuts and changes with a machete than with a surgical scalpel. With regard to the second question, can you repeat that one again? What was the...
Around the alliances in the Indo-Pacific,
Right.
Where does Australia sit relative to the others in terms of US priorities?
Who knows, right? I mean, there's so much uncertainty, right? So it could be on any given day if Turnbull says something, if Albanese says something, then, the flattery or the wrath could come this way. But in terms of the future in overall, I think Australia stands in a pretty good position just based on history and the importance that Australia plays to America's, strategic aims in the region.
Yeah, I might have a little bit of a go at the American interest question. Look, interests do tend to be generally not that changeable in the way that we assume, or have come to assume, that Donald Trump changes his mind. There are some, I think, strategic baselines for the United States when it comes to the Indo-Pacific space, and that is that its main real peer competitor is there. And a main real peer competitor that it has spent quite a long time trying to initially assumed that it would socialise it within the community of, if not democratic nations, then perhaps pluralist states. That didn't happen, and now China wants to socialise us and the United States. So I think there is that enduring interest in terms of China, but there are also more interests in terms of security beyond just China. There's, of course, the Korean Peninsula to think about. There's, of course, potential instability in the South China Sea, and yes, China plays a role in that. I think that one of the things that Australians do struggle with, and this goes a little bit back to what Evan was saying about, well, actually, I think that, the way the Americans have articulated their interests has been pretty clear, or they've been pretty clear about, their statements about the region. I was in Singapore last year talking to a bunch of folk from the Pentagon who'd come out for a conference, and we decided to meet halfway in Singapore. And they said, well, you're an Australian, and this is under Biden, of course. Can you tell us what integrated deterrence is? Because we have no idea. And I said, well, look, unfortunately, I can't be of any assistance because when I'm back home in Canberra, the main sense I get, as one of my colleagues put it, was the Americans have spoken about integrated deterrence, and now we have to try and figure out what they've actually said. So I think a lot of times, the policy community will parse things to death. But unless you're sort of clear and unequivocal about your interests, and maybe that clear and unequivocal statement isn't something that Australia wants to hear in terms of strategic competition.
But I mean, what you're talking about, it's a little apples and oranges. That's not about interest. That's more about policy and priorities. I mean, my answer to the interest question, U.S. interests in the Pacific, the U.S. showed up in the Pacific in the 1780s, right? It sent a clipper ship called the Empress of China. I think it was 1782. May have the year wrong. But anyway, it was roughly 1780s, 1790s. And to your point about commerce, it's not an accident that the U.S. showed up in the region with a clipper ship. So U.S. interests were pretty consistent for over 200 years. It was basically open sea lanes because we're a maritime power, and no hegemon that was hostile to the United States that would close the region. That was the open door in the 18 up until today. So those were pretty consistent. In a normal setup now, we would have a national conversation about what we're about globally. But what's happened in the last 7 or 8 weeks is a little more ad hoc. There's a little bit of a wrecking ball where it's not happening amid a national conversation. What I would say as an American, Courtney's an American too, I mean, what I find a little, depressing is the right adjective, but all of that stuff that goes beyond those two interests that I just laid out, things like promoting our values or basing US forces, all of this stuff came out of the post-war period when the United States was basically a fundamentally optimistic country. And if you rewind all these things that he's taken a wrecking ball to, USAID, global media agencies, all of that stuff, these are Cold War institutions and structures and policies. And for all that the Cold War was scary, it reflected an optimistic vision of what the US could be about. So if you go back to President Kennedy's speeches, Kennedy founded AID. It was about what the United States represented in the world. And the conversation we're going through apparently in our politics now seems to be much less optimistic. And this was alluded to by people in the audience and people on the stage. A lot of my fellow countrymen and women seem to have a very negative view of where the United States is, what that means for our role and posture in the world. And so if we're not fundamentally optimistic, you have a very different view of fighting tropical disease in Africa. And if you go on Twitter, X, you'll see a lot of comments from people. Every time I tweet something about AID, I get back a lot of snarky comments about, what the hell do we care about disease in this country or that country? And to me, putting aside whether I agree or disagree with the sentiment, and I disagree, it reflects a much more pessimistic view of it's kind of where we are in our national psychology now. We're not like we were when Kennedy was around. And so then you go to what does that mean for the region? If the United States is fundamentally pessimistic, fundamentally antagonistic, doesn't want to lean forward in the world, that is, to quote Kevin Rudd in a completely different context, he was talking about the trade negotiation tonight, but he said something like, we're dealing with a very different United States. That is a very different United States because we were fundamentally an optimistic, forward-looking, future-oriented country, and that shaped our not just our interests, but our policies. Our policies. And I think the jury's out on that because Trump was elected partly because a lot of people feel that way, but his poll numbers are fluctuating. Americans are famously fickle. We change around. So and that's why, to go back to where I started, which is on the alliance, 7 weeks doesn't wash 70 years of history. And that's why, I think Sam put it really well when he said, let's take a long-term view, but long-term doesn't mean forever, and you can't it's unserious to ignore what's happening. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but that's,
Thank you, and I think that's a good note to end on. It's been a good discussion of a really important topic at a very challenging and interesting time. So please join me in thanking our panelists.